Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the second event of the cycle of seminars and roundtables on global health titled Medicine for Peace and organized by the Interdisciplinary Center of Peace Sciences at the University of Pisa. The focus of today's event is on post-colonial approaches to international health, and I'm very pleased to introduce the speakers. Edna Bonhomme from Munich Center from Global History, University of Munich, Eugene Richardson from Harvard Medical School, Harvard University, and the chair, Mauro Capocci from the Department of Civilizations and Foreign Knowledge at the University of Pisa. Thank you so much for being here today. And before I let Mauro to take on, I would like to invite the audience to ask their questions, either in English or Italian, using the chat of the social media you're using, be that Facebook or YouTube, so that these can be answered during the discussion that will follow the seminars. Thank you, and please, Mauro.
Okay. Thank you, and welcome everybody. Thank you, Valentina, for organizing this this seminar, and thank you, Eugene and Edna, for accepting the invitation here. So today we are going to discuss clearly the coloniality of global public health. So how colonialism actually is still a driving force, a pillar actually of our global public health efforts. Actually, is not a problem of contemporary public health, but it's actually rooted in the history of medicine, of Western medicine, and how Western medicine cooperated actually with colonialism. Basically, the history of Western medicine, it is a history of globalization, a history of encounters and exchanges with different cultures. Most of the history of Western medicine has been actually unfair exchanges, because actually we Western peoples, actually we brought over several diseases and several scourges to other people, and of course we exploited resources, natural resources, also for creating drugs. For example, in quinine against malaria, we found the quinine in South America in the bark of cinchona tree, and we brought it to Europe and to create a European monopoly over this important drug. Also, Western diseases were exported, and then with slave trade, for example, from Africa to the Americas, we expanded and exported some diseases towards the so-called new continent, the Americas. So the situation actually worsened with the Industrial Revolution, as everybody here may know. Imperial medicine actually gained a lot of momentum after at the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution, the steam power that actually changed the way we see fare, the way we travel over the seas. So that actually the travels, intercontinental travels, were actually much faster after the introduction of steam power. So basically, globalization dramatically increased with the circulation of humans and goods that reached a much larger scale after the introduction of steam power and the opening of new sea routes, thanks to the availability of these new means of transport. These also allowed for the growth of larger cities, for example, port cities in South America, but all over the world, large port cities began to grow up at a dramatical pace, so that basically this new globalization allowed for the spread of disease, both in the so-called colonies, both in European cities. Actually, this new wave of spreading of disease actually is epitomized by cholera disease that came into Europe at the beginning of 19th century, most probably from India, because now with faster sea routes, it was easier for people with the disease to travel to Europe. So the contagion was possible now that now that the travels were so fast. So cholera is a prime example of the disease that arrived to Europe and posed a threat to this European public health in the first half of the 20th century. Later, other diseases came into Europe and North America from the colonies. For example, yellow fever and even plague actually posed a threat to European public health in the 19th century. Plague actually was almost eradicated from Europe in the 18th century, but in the 19th century it was still perceived as a threat because in the Ottoman Empire and in the British East colonies and in China it was still endemic as a disease. So the fear for the Europeans was that this disease could come back to Europe with globalization of goods and human travels, so that a new framework for the protection of Europe from this disease was created, along with the Pasteurian doctrines and the new microbial theories of the disease. So within this new framework, basically, Europe created this new border against other areas of the world, and especially towards Africa and Asia. It created a protective border, with medicine being an important part of this protective border towards mostly Asia and Africa, in order to prevent these diseases to reach for Europe. In this regard, actually, European countries have set up also international systems, international settings where the colonial powers, basically European nations, could meet up and manage public health in the colonial areas, and also in places that were not colonies actually at the time, like for example in the Ottoman Empire, in Egypt, for example, or in Turkey, in Constantinople. The maritime health councils and maritime health conventions were created in the second half of the 19th century in order to some way to police the world against the potential contagion of Europe. And the main threats at the time were yellow fever and plague and cholera, which were basically tropical diseases, what we call now basically tropical diseases. On the other hand, also within the colonial powers, especially in England, but also in France and Germany, and also in Italy, biomedical scientists created a new scientific field, which was called colonial medicine or tropical medicine. Colonial or tropical, according to the different political flavors in the different countries. The object of this new discipline were actually malaria, leishmaniasis, of course, yellow fever, cholera, plague, sleeping sickness, all these kind of contagious diseases that were considered to be common for the tropical countries, but the fact was that the very idea of creating tropical medicine actually was a colonial idea. Everything happened in a colonial perspective. As an example, even in Italy, we had colonial and tropical medicine journals and institutions created in the first half of the 20th century. With journals discussing malaria, leishmaniasis, and so on. They started as colonial journals, as colonial tropical institutions, but then in the end, actually, they ended up reporting clinical cases from Italy itself, because actually most of these diseases that were supposed to be colonial or tropical actually were still endemic in Italy. Leishmaniasis and malaria, for example. Malaria still in the 1910s had something like 2 million cases each year in Italy. So basically, in Italy, you cannot really discuss colonial malaria as a colonial disease, because it actually was present in the rural and backwards parts of the southern part of Italy, also in north, but they were not so backward, and it was not so severe. Even cholera actually still struck Italy in 1910s. In Naples, there has been a severe epidemic in 1910, 1911, and still there's been a small epidemic in 1973 in Naples. So actually, yesterday there was this disease in Italy. So basically, the idea of colonial medicine comes up because there is a politics of colonialism, and the tropical medicine, it was an integral part of this colonial expansion. And actually, it was part of an effort to create a sort of natural category for mirroring the distinction between civilized and rich and healthy north of the world, that is the European countries ruling the world through the colonial system, and the uncivilized and backward south and colonized world. So basically, the distinction between a place where there are all these terrible diseases and a place where sanitation and the advancement of economics and the social progress actually make us immune of this kind of diseases. Still, these diseases actually were endemic, where actually they were part of the disease landscapes in the also in the temperate areas, because again we see that malaria and other diseases like also yellow fever was present in New Orleans, for example, up until the 1910s. So these places where these diseases were actually affecting the planet independently of the climate. But to give them a biological dimension, a natural dimension, an ecological dimension, like calling them tropical diseases, meant that they were part of another. They were coming from another part of the world. They could be an invasion for us, and they didn't belong to us. Colonial dominators coming from the north of Europe, the white European civilization. And also this meant that the civilizing mission of the European white men could be fully deployed also by medicine and colonialism altogether, because actually medicine and colonialism were part of the same effort at least to go and civilized the barbarians, the backward populations of the south of the world. Even and I'm going to conclude with this, there is a wonderful quote from Charles Nicoll, which was the Nobel Prize winner for the discovery of typhus. Of typhus vaccination, and he was the director of the famous Pasteur Institute in Paris. So really, the heir of Pasteur and of his, the protector of his legacy of bringing the microbial science to the rest of the world. And Charles Nicoll, in 1934, as late as 1934, he wrote in the lectures at the Institut de France. They were later in 1936. These lectures were published under the title "Responsabilité de la médecine," the responsibility of medicine. So he wrote, and I quote, "The work of expanding civilization, that is, the work of colonization, involves a medical part. This is so strictly related to the whole colonial enterprise that it appears difficult to separate them at all." This was clearly stated in 1934 by this important hero of medicine, Charles Nicoll, in France, because actually, of course, the Pasteur Institute expanded all over the world in the French colonies in order to to bring over this, to expand the civilizing mission of the colonial French power. So basically, that's why we are here to ask today. Still, after 80 years after Charles Nicolle, is it possible to ask now if it's possible to break up the relation between colonialism and Western medicine? So this enduring relation that we used in the title of this seminar, is it possible to be broken up by in contemporary world? And we are asking these to our two guests today. The first one is Edna Bornholm. She's an historian of science. Thank you very much for being here, Edna. She's an historian of science, currently based in Germany, in Munich, as we heard, but she grew up in the United States, and she earned a PhD in history from Princeton. And as far as I remember, she has a master in public health. She's also trained in biomedical sciences, and she works currently on the intersection of medicine, gender, and race, with the aim of decolonizing actually our current gaze on health and disease. She's also an activist and an artist, and relating to these themes, so she's her research activity is actually doubled by this involvement in multimedia art, and which aims at exploring the coloniality. I've seen some of your works on the website, and they're wonderful, very interesting and stimulating. And she connects in a critical way Western science and traditional healing practices. Actually, your Edna's current project is on Black health in Germany, concerning narratives and media representation of African diaspora in Germany. She will talk today about sexual apartheid in the Second World War years. That is the relation between U.S. public health policy and local populations in the Panama Canal, basically in the years of Second World War. So the floor is yours, Edna. Thank you very much again for being here and accepting our invitation. 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much for allowing me to have the opportunity to be able to speak. I want to thank the other organizers, and specifically also the other participant, Eugene, as well as care workers and everyone who's helped to make this possible. In addition to that, can you see my screen? Or no? Can you see? Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. I'm going to try that again. Apologies. There, and it is suddenly disappeared. There, can you see it? Correct.
Not yet.
Not yet.
We cannot see now the screen. Davide.
Okay.
Let's see what happens.
And play.
Okay, yeah, here we are.
Okay.
Perfect.
So thank you again for being able to provide this context to why it's important to think about epidemics. And I think that talking about colonial histories is really important right now as we excavate the gaps and silences of people who are often oppressed. And in some ways, this is very pertinent in the context of what I'll be talking about today, which is a draft chapter for one of my upcoming projects, which looks at sexual apartheid and the US public health policy. So I wanted to start off with one particular movie. You'll hear a little bit of the sound, but that's not completely relevant at the moment. The movie is called Sex Hygiene from 1942, and it was part of the World War II military training that was directed by John Ford and produced by Daryl Zanuck. The film was shown to servicemen in World War II and provides a graphic and frank presentation of the types of treatments for what they refer to as venereal diseases, or what we call sexually transmitted infections today. In 1942, the US Public Health Service distributed this film, Sex Hygiene, as an educational film to basically scare servicemen straight so as to ensure that they would not have sexual relations. As you can see, the video begins with the people playing pool, a vinyl record, it appears a group of men are socializing, and what sets this film apart from other sex education films is that it was specifically targeted towards military men. And later in the film, the narrator states, the greatest risk is venereal disease. And shortly after that, he advises soldiers to remain abstinent, warning them against the dangers of syphilis. 5 years later, another film appeared on the scene, and that film is called Easy to Get, which is, in this particular representation, a protagonist is caught in a courtship. He meets a young woman in his hometown, they share walks at the park, and eventually have a sexual affair before he heads off to his unit. The narrator reveals in an ominous tone that this affair will lead to his demise, and that the man has contracted syphilis. The foundational message of both films is clear. Military men should not engage in sexual activities, otherwise they risk getting a sexually transmitted infection. However, the distinction between the first film and, as you can see from the second film, is that while the first one they have a very similar style and manner, the first is entirely white and this film, Easy to Get, is entirely Black. The public health messaging in the US military even segregated how it portrayed sex education, and by extension, I argue, public health policy. These visualization of public health messages through film and posters, as demonstrated in front of you, came at a time in which the United States Public Health Service wanted to instruct and provide anti-vice and also moral typology of sexual health, both in the United States and abroad. One place where that specific policy was put into place, especially around sexually transmitted infections and what people have referred to as tropical diseases, was strong felt in the Panama Canal Zone, which was both a military and commercial outpost that has also a site of public health campaigns featured into what I refer to as sexual apartheid. I'm borrowing from Harriet Washington, who you see in front of you, who coined the term medical apartheid. And her work is very pivotal in how we think about the history of medicine and science, especially with respect to discrimination. But beyond that, it allows us to understand how the histories of medicine and science, all in their colonial dimension, also are tied to differential treatment. I argue that sexual apartheid was also at play in US military context, not just in films, in the ones that I showed between Easy to Get and Sex Hygiene, but they also were implemented in anti-venereal media campaigns within the colonial context, especially as World War II served as a fulcrum for disease prevention among soldiers. And in neo-colonial outposts such as Panama, the colonial friction between the US military and Panamanians centered on sexual apartheid through the deployment of carceral quarantine. Since the early 20th century, Panama has featured as a liminal space where US-occupied canal became a place of militarization and also sanitary interventions. The canal was a sphere of US administration under the colonial treaty rights established at the time of US-sponsored secession of the Panama from Colombia in 1903. But it was also repeatedly argued by the US administration that the zone remained under Panamanian sovereignty. Panama was a special case of US imperial health administration, given the unique juridical structure of the canal zone and its border cities within the context of Panama and Colón. By 1942, the United States and Panama established a sexually transmitted disease program. At first, the program was meant to register established sex workers, but yet over time, the program included the strict supervision and closure of brothels, and eventually the direct control and incarceration of women who were outside at night, regardless of the actual business of what they were tending to. In addition to that, Panamanian women were often arrested if they were presented outside of stratified regions within the Panama Canal Zone, showing that race and class stratified the containment of syphilis. This labor was not done alone, but through the coordination of specific officers of the US Public Health Service. One such person was Oliver Clarence Weniger. who was a director of the US Health Service and published a report about the medical situation in Panama. By then a stronghold of the US military, but mostly because it was a commercial bridge between the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. This enabled the rapid transit of material and troops from throughout the World War II. And in addition to that, he noted that there were 200 patients with syphilis, with another 300 having STIs. Among the people who were positive were US Army soldiers who had been deployed to Panama at the height of the war. Winger estimated that 5% of Panamanians were affected with STIs, and it's important to note his involvement in this particular study, mostly because he was one of the main government officials who was tied to this Tuskegee syphilis study, which spanned from 1932 to 1972. And of course, Tuskegee has gotten a lot of attention, especially in the United States, with respect to why some members of the African-American community are skeptical of science research. At the same time, obviously, that experiment is different from our current moment. And it's important to note how Winger was not just involved in the domestic issue of uneven and medical apartheid in the US, but was also involved in these public health campaigns against sexually transmitted infections within the US, outside of the US context in Panama. So Winger's experimentation on Black and mixed race people in the US occupied Caribbean and American South reflected US health policy, one that was orchestrated around colonial intervention. US Americans in the Panama Canal Zone adapted and expanded the terms of some forms of segregation. And life for many people within the context of the Panama region looked quite different. So in front of you is one of the Panamanian zones or areas at the time, which was very low income. And then in other contexts, specifically those that were occupied by Americans or Panamanians of more European ancestry, they were based in the more affluent areas. And so these forms of spatial segregation were a basis of institutionalized and class distinctions under the infamous gold and silver roll system, which also meant that labor was also segregated. And at a time that there was ongoing belief that the Panamanians were unfit to work for the canal organization, this had a basis as to who had access to or who was deemed to be relevant in the canal zone. At the same time, women who were present in the public urban space came to be seen in very conflicting ways by the US Health Service and authorities, and at times were perceived as sex workers, even though it was a moment in which Panamanian feminists were building effective movement for suffrage, equal pay, and more. Panamanian women who were visible in public spaces for amongst some of the US military and public health officials created anxiety. And they were considered perennial sex workers and by extension, carriers of syphilis. The campaign to suppress the presence of Panamanian women in public spaces led to the incarceration of some of them and their admission to the Panama City's venereal disease hospital, all while US soldiers could move freely throughout the Panama Canal. US settlement of the Panama Canal and the imposition of a system of racial apartheid was carried out because of the concern about venereal diseases, with women of color held captive in some cases, and GI soldiers, and specifically Johns, free to move around in the zone. So in many ways, the fear of bacterial infection and specifically sexually transmitted infections created anxieties concerning around multisexual activities, but also it was part of implementing repressive measures for the carceral quarantine of female bodies, new forms of regulation aimed at suppressing the sexuality of Panamanians in the urban space. Targeting Panamanian and Caribbean women, especially, and seeing them as harbors of syphilis further impacted the colonial dimensions and the imperial dimensions of the US being there. Although Panamanians and Caribbeans were more likely to contract at the time tuberculosis or pneumonia, the health department of the Canal Zone persistently targeted sexually transmitted infections because of the moral panic around STIs. At the same time, locals resisted these portrayals. In the Panama Tribune, they were very critical of the unevenness of the US public health efforts, challenging that the separate and unequal colonial discourse surrounding STIs. And they suggested that the news reports in the first days of May 1946, reporting on the military's establishment of off-limit zones for Panamanians were draconian and repressed the labor of those who were engaged in all kinds of activities. Women, Panamanian women in particular, resisted by circumventing arrests and challenging incarceration in the face of such regulation. And while this case study of US public health policy in Panama might seem like an aberration from what has gone on since, it reflects a general anxiety about sex education, and sexual health as carried out by the US government in other global contexts. For example, the global gag rule, which was reinstated by the 45th President of the United States, has advocated to decriminalize abortion or the expansion of abortion services. And so the global fight for sexual autonomy, which was something that was quite repressed beginning with Ronald Reagan in 1984 with the introduction of the global gag rule, has created unprecedented and unjustified expansion of weaponizing US aid, specifically around health, and limiting abortion and sexual health for people in the global south. This action is particularly critical more than ever, especially as we undergo and live through a current pandemic in which the ensuing negative effects of healthcare access and reproductive health is becoming increasingly difficult. So beyond what has happened in Panama, it speaks to another dimension of what we should think about today. That is to say, what is the social life of disease, and how do racialized groups who are disproportionately surveilled and perceived as disease come to imagine themselves? What does it mean to have an unequal policing policy on sex, sexuality, sex education, as well as public health policies? What the issue in Panama showed is that women's bodies were criminalized while US soldier sexuality was tolerated and subtly disciplined, which forged a unique formation of trans-border containment through the uneven distribution of fears and pleasures across the time and space of occupation. The control of sexually transmitted infections by the United States during the 20th century demonstrated that public health policy had less to do with disease prevention and more to do with holding up a racial apartheid. Epidemics aren't just about the bacteria and the viruses that coexist with us, but they reflect social divisions that push some people to the periphery of society. What happened in Panama is a social history of how illness and disorders play out for marginalized people and those who are colonized, and also how people are perceived as infected in the context of US military occupation and those who actively resist the social forces that restrict their movement. This is not merely a medical history, but a cultural criticism that tries to uncover the politics of containment, and then also to challenge the imperial ideology that lives today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Edna. Let's see, we have been perfectly in time, actually. So thank you very much for that. Let's see if is there any comments or questions from the public. For short questions, we have space for short questions now before the general discussion at the end, that is after Eugene talked. Let's see if comes anything from the public. Well, right now, let's see also on the YouTube. Well, I have one question now, but which I think it's appropriate to make it now, because I would say that how do the U.S. Public Health Service address the problem of Panamanian men? Actually, because actually, of course, they were part of the sexual transmission of the disease within the populations. So were they present in the public health program, or they just were concerned about sex workers, female sex workers? So ruling out any kind of homosexual activity, ruling out any control of the family, no Panamian sexual activity between men and women that is excluding also the Americans. Is there anything about that in the archives or?
So that's an excellent question. One thing I would say is, starting off even with the video, is that part of what assumptions are made by the people who are implementing these public health policies is a heteronormative sexual kind of cosmology within the context, not just within the military, but also beyond. So there's an assumption that, people are having same-sex activities, when in reality, there are all kinds of sexual relationships that are happening within the colonial context, within the military, by Panamanians themselves. So that's one specific, I guess, historical bias by the people living at the time who had control over public health messaging, that unfortunately queer relationships or queer sexual activities weren't formally presented, at least in this sex education material. And concerning the question around who was targeted as a sex worker and who was seen as a sex worker within the context of the records, it's mostly women who that are being targeted, that are being detained and arrested. And that could also have to do with the assumptions about sex economic exchange at the time during the 40s, insofar that the majority of the US Americans who were based in the Canal Zone at the time were men associated with the military, and many of them were going to the brothels, or some of them were going to the brothels, and the assumption that the people whom they engaged with sex economic exchange were women. The extent to which that I have been able to find examples of male-to-male paid activity, that is something I'm still looking for. However, most of the context is focusing on these heteronormative relationships. And I would say that part of what is also going on is the regulation of women in public spaces isn't unique to Panama in this moment. It happened in the US, it happened in other contexts and countries. But what is difficult is that the colonial and military intervention makes it quite difficult for people to challenge it unless it's through a collective measure. And is also, in the language of medicine and science, can come as for the greater good of these individuals, when in fact it's more about the moral anxiety of interracial, interethnic socialization within these public zones. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see if there is any comment coming in. Okay, not now, since maybe for the at the end of the discussion. So thank you very much, Edna. I'm going to introduce now our second guest, Eugene Richardson from Harvard Medical School of the Harvard University, and he's a physician and anthropologist, both trained in medicine and anthropology, and involved in epidemic management in Africa with some NGOs, especially with importance in health. So he also acts as a consultant to the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the African Center for Disease Control. And so he was part of the field response to the Ebola epidemic in Congo in recent years. So really, this experience led him to question deeply the nature and the epistemology of the global public health as it is currently understood and practiced now. Particularly, he questions the enduring colonial roots of global public health, And on this subject, he wrote the book Epidemic Illusions, this one here, by the MIT Press. And he will discuss basically the core of the book in his talk now. So thank you very much again for being here, Eugene. And again, 25 minutes. And so the floor is yours now. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. And thanks to the organizers and to the audience for joining, and to my co-panelist for a fantastic presentation. All right. So, as mentioned, I'll talk about a bit about the book I wrote on this topic and some of the experiences that led to the writing of it. And then some recent work we've been doing on essentially epistemic violence or epistemic injustice. The book is called Epidemic Illusions on the Coloniality of Global Public Health. And this kind of sums it up right here. This is the Harvard Shield that normally says Veritas. You know, the idea is that these centers of Western knowledge production can often impose interpretations of social and health phenomena on the world. And I guess I should start by saying that my philosophy of science stance is neo-Kantian in that I divide the natural sciences from social inquiry. I think there is an epistemic divide. So I don't have critiques of, physiological studies or things like masks prevent COVID transmission, tobacco causes cancer, 3 quarks make a proton. What I'm critiquing in what we call global public health science is social inquiry. So any inquiry that has to do with human behavior, interpreting social phenomenon, forecasting, these things, I think it is impossible to not approach them without your ideological presuppositions. You know, how you curate facts, how you choose variables, what you're even choosing to forecast brings together pre-held suppositions. And usually those go unexamined, and usually they do work for elites. And I'll give some examples of that. But that's what this shield means, that these ways that we end up imposing, these interpretations of how outbreaks start, of what we can do to intervene on them, they actually impose a way of understanding health phenomena that usually dismisses local understandings, hence the monopolium veritatis. And here is my Twitter handle in case people want to continue discussion there. So here's the cover of the book, and the book is rather experimental. So you can see with that image at the beginning, what I'm trying to do as far as, rattling understandings of global public health science. Here, the cover is a play on Plato's cave. So, the original cave had people tied up, chained up. All they could see was the images or the shadows of these images. Here's a coronavirus. And then the philosopher or the social scientist would escape, go see the real world, go up into the sun and see the real world, and then come back and say, "Oh, you're all been misled. This is what the truth really is." And that is an inheritance of kind of the Platonic Western tradition, goes all the way to Descartes, that there is this Archimedes point, or there are objective ways of understanding social phenomena, that there is a universal truth to interpreting health and social phenomena. The allegory of the warren, so a warren is where rabbits live, that there are many caves, many burrows, is a pluriversal way of seeing the world, that there are actually many ways to put together facts about social phenomena, many ways to interpret, many ways to forecast, that vie for the forefront of our consciousness. And, under a pragmatic notion of truth, which is truth is what we come to agree upon, usually the ways that support elite interests are the interpretations, are the collations of facts that come to the forefront. And the ways that have more of a justice angle towards putting information together usually get sidelined. And I'll give some examples of how that happens. But to me, I'm more interested in, that to me is what I would call epistemic injustice. How people's perceptions are actually colonized by the way economists, sociologists, anthropologists, epidemiologists collate data. So I'll give a quick example of why I started down this track. This is a Doctors Without Borders field clinic in South Sudan. Well, this was before it was its own country. And even before I went to medical school, I ran the lab, here's the lab, at a field hospital in Bentiu in southern Sudan. Here's the team, here's where we lived, here's the hospital. So we have the nurses and charts and beds and bed nets. But one of the missions we went on was to observe these villages that were being burned down in central Sudan. And what we found out was that these paramilitaries from the north, or mujahideen, were burning the villages and sending people to displaced person camps in the south, where we were essentially there taking care of them, so that the Chinese could continue the oil exploration uninterrupted in central Sudan. And then they were piping the oil up to the coast in Port Sudan. And I spoke to some Arab doctors at a military garrison nearby, and they said, Doctors Without Borders, they're all part of our military campaign. I said, how is that? And they said, well, after these people are burned out of the areas where the oil is, they come to these displaced person camps. You take care of them. We were treating, leishmaniasis, TB, malaria, acute malnutrition. We were also paying nurses $100 a month, and they said that they knew that supported extended families up to 40 people. And by doing this, we were preventing the ranks of the Southern People's Liberation Army from getting extra combatants, because you really have to hit rock bottom to join that. So we were part of the war effort to lessen the ranks of their enemy forces. And so, I was very naive at the time and thought, oh, wow, I knew this was an example of internal colonialism, but I didn't understand how humanitarian organizations could be used as pawns in this type of work. And so that's when I started thinking about the double-edged sword that is aid and development. And I started, working more in sub-Saharan Africa, started reading people like Kwame Nkrumah, who I should have read earlier, who said as early as the 1960s that, aid and development are just something the global north gives a little bit with the right hand to disguise the huge amount of profit and theft that's going on in the right. And that led me down a path where I started seeing not just aid and development as neo-colonial tools, really to just, again, give a little to disguise the continued extractive economies, but that what we call global public health science, like the actual academic work, further colluded in occulting this type of extraction. And I'll give some examples of that. So my position really then is not, what the typical anthropologist does is, go somewhere, study the other, report on their experience. In this case, report on the experience of epistemic violence. My goal is really to comment on how this epistemic violence or symbolic violence is committed. Since I have worked in places like Doctors Without Borders and Partners in Health and elite universities and the UN and the World Health Organization and the World Bank and the CDC. So it's more of a report on how epistemic violence is committed. And so one of the things I like to start out with in talking especially to epidemiologists and public health specialists is that this aid development model sort of presupposes a moral relation between the global north and global south of one as, potential saviors, that somehow the global north had its riches, it developed itself, and now it's able to share these excess riches with less developed people in the global south. And that is what we call development. But if you look at the data, that, the idea of development is a total farce. So Jason Hickel and colleagues have calculated a net appropriation of $152 trillion from the global south since 1960. And that doesn't even count the illicit financial flows. With regards to illicit financial flows, there's a report from 2017 by Jubilee and others that shows the continent of Africa received $160 billion in aid, loan, and remittances in the year prior. But $200 billion went out in illicit financial flows, just illegal theft of resources, tax evasion, trade misinvoicing. So the continent is a net creditor of $40 billion to the global north. They are developing us. The idea that there is this excess wealth in the global north that is shared as a form of aid and development, again, is a farce. That we continue extraction as we did back in colonial times under more, occulted neo-colonial mechanisms. And that's why I think, personally, the Panama Papers were probably one of the most substantial global health interventions of the past 5 years, because they're starting to lift the lid on how companies continue this extraction, how they avoid the taxes, how they hide the money in shell companies. And so therefore, if we start to see our relation as beneficiaries from a global institutional order that systematizes extraction and socioeconomic oppression, exactly what the Panama Papers were showing, then the intervention turns from this aid development epic to one of, era to one of reparative justice. So if we saw the 1800s maybe as a century of abolition movements, abolition of slavery, and the 1900s as a century of human rights discourse and aid and development, then perhaps the 2000s can be a century of reparative justice. And I serve as the co-chair for the Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistributive Justice. And we're looking at things like, we have several sections, all of them run by people that would be beneficiaries of said reparations movements. But for example, one section on the descendants of people enslaved in the US, which is looking to eradicate the wealth gap between white and black people, has calculated a $10 to $12 trillion wealth gap. That is a result, that is a legacy of, enslavement, Jim Crow, redlining, hyper-incarceration, lethal policing, unfair credit markets, and access to education. And that reparations would be paid to descendants, to the 40 million descendants of people enslaved in the US, as a way to eradicate this wealth gap. We're also looking at apartheid in South Africa, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. How much did the US and Belgium owe for their centuries of colonial extraction, and so on. I'm more interested in symbolic reparations. How does global public health science collude in these continued extractive orders? And how would shaking up the way we represent global health allow us to work more on reparative justice? So I use this framework of coloniality, which can be described as a matrix of power relations that persistently manifests despite a former colony's achievement of nationhood. It attempts to capture the racial, political, economic, social, epistemological, linguistic, and gendered hierarchical orders imposed by European colonialism that transcended independence movements and continue to oppress in accordance with the needs of capital accumulation. I will say it's not the only framework with which to examine this. My colleagues that work on the project of descendants of enslavement in the US would say, well, we were not colonized, this was enslavement. Or we have another section on caste in India, and they would say the same thing. So there are a variety of theories, whether we want to call it racial capitalism. A colleague of mine is talking about indigenizing humanitarian work. I think all of it, though, deals with socioeconomic oppression and how there are symbolic orders that are created to support it. So Ramon Grossvogel says the heterogeneous and multiple global structures put in place over 450 years did not evaporate with these independence movements. We continue to live under the same colonial power matrix. We just moved from global colonialism to global coloniality. And then Sabelo and Lovo says, despite the celebration of decolonization as a milestone in the African history of liberation, Africa has not managed to free itself from epistemological colonization, inscribed on the continent and its people by mission and secular schools, schools of tropical medicine, schools of public health, religious denominations, and other institutions that carried Western cultural imperialism. So this is the main project of the book, as Edward Said did in Orientalism, to show how this discipline of social science really carried, Oriental studies, carried Western cultural imperialism. I try to show that what we think of as epidemiology, global public health science, actually carries Western cultural imperialism as well. Another way of looking at this is how I'm trying to examine how people's perceptions are colonized. Ngugi wa Thiong'o has to say that colonialism imposed its control on the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship, but its most important area of domination was the mental universe, the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceive themselves and their relationship to the world. And that's what the book tries to go through several examples of how public health studies really impose ways of perceiving health phenomena, usually individualistic ways that support neoliberalism and market fundamentalism, very rarely ways that support socio-historical determinants and therefore interventions in reparative justice. I refer to this type of science as bourgeois empiricism. These models of disease causation that obscure socio-historical forces are themselves political acts, and they give support to social structures that hide behind scientific objectivity to perpetuate dependency, exploitation, racism, elitism, and colonialism. I also use the term symbolic violence, which is another way of thinking of this capacity for imposing ways of understanding the world. Here's a paper we wrote using this framework to help understand social protection on Ebola survivor well-being in Sierra Leone. The book is rather experimental, so I make use of détournement, which was the French style of protest from the 50s and 60s, where you would take an advertisement or a poster and rearrange its symbols to create, different understandings. So here's the poster you would see when you land in Sierra Leone, as far as, if you're sick, going to the health center to get tested for Ebola. But then we found the health centers were amplifying transmission because they were completely underdeveloped. And so when I look at a poster like this, it reifies that Ebola virus is a cause of this sickness, right? And to me, Ebola is just a marker for a determinative web of colonial legacies and post-colonial legacies that result in a kind of a health infrastructure that allows these outbreaks to occur. So a real poster to understand like causes of why people get sick might look like this. So we have epistemic violence, we have structural adjustment, the Holocaust of slavery, barbaric colonialism, purposeful underdevelopment, and then here's those illicit financial flows that continue to this day. These are the real pathologies, and they lead to underdeveloped health centers. Part of the call is for epidemiologists to see themselves not as these, philosophers trying to find capital T truth about health phenomena, but really to start struggling against the forms of power, which they are both objects and instruments. And so I launch a big critique on mathematical models. I see them merely as fables dressed in formal language. For the most part, they serve not as forecasts because they're most of the time they're very wrong, but means of setting epistemic confines to the understanding of why some groups live sicker lives than others. And this article here serves as the afterword in the book, but it exists as a standalone article in BMJ Global Health. So here's an example of symbolic violence from an article in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, Spatial and Temporal Dynamics of Super Spreading Events in the 2014-15 West Africa Ebola epidemic. They use the term super spreader 38 times in this paper. And by super spreader, they mean this poor Ebola patient here. And once they published the paper, the newspapers interviewed the authors, and this was the headline of the article about the study, that super spreaders drove the Ebola epidemic. And they even say that in the paper. The super spreaders drove it. If we could only find these super spreaders early in the outbreak, the 20% of people that cause 80% of infections, we could stop. And this picture was in the newspaper with it. If we only found these people, we could make the outbreak smaller. And so this is what a critical theorist does. They don't look at they look at the categories of thought we use, and they don't look at them whether they have truth or validity about them. They look at the work they do, the ideological work especially. So super spreader, it's not, for a person that infects, say, 8 other people, it's actually factual that they could be called a super spreader. But we wrote a paper about how the mining companies in Sierra Leone could be thought of as super spreaders, because the amount of wealth that they've extracted and stolen and taxes they've avoided, the total amount of that could easily have built a health infrastructure that would have stopped Ebola in its tracks. So companies like that set the stage for super spreading. So why are they not called super spreaders? It's equally factual to refer to the extractive mining companies, the theft that's been going on, as super spreaders, but no one does that. Because they'll say it's too political or it's too hard to quantify how much they are. But, calling a mining company super spreader and calling this poor individual super spreader does very different work. This supports a neoliberal individualistic frame of understanding. It supports an aid and development model. Calling the mining company super spreader starts to bring interventions back to, Panama Papers and reparative justice. Even taking it further to colonial legacies from the UK, starts to get into real reparative action. How many trillions does the UK owe Sierra Leone? And if those were paid, would we even be talking about Ebola outbreaks in the first place? We have yet to total that up, but Utsa Patnaik calculated that the UK stole $45 trillion from India during the colonial period. That's many times their GDP. This would take hundreds of years to pay off. But this is the type of intervention I think we're looking at in the future to redress legacies of colonialism. So again, the book criticizes epidemiology as a dispositif or an apparatus for different ideologies. It has critiques of causal inference, big data, regression models, and epidemic modeling. In the last few minutes, I'll talk about these two. So here's a good article in The Nation, Are Bill Gates' Billions Distorting Public Health Data? Bill Gates gave over $600 million to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is called the premier epidemiology unit in the world. And let's just take a quick look at their COVID-19 forecasts to see what kind of ideological work they can do. First, the true number of next day deaths that they predicted were outside of the real number 70% of the time. So they were completely wrong. But their plunging projections were also used by Trump to say that he was doing a competent and effective job. So the forecasts are this is not outbreak science. This is creating a social imaginary that is easily co-opted for ideological purposes. But the forecasts, they make no intervention into risk structure. They only say, wear a mask, social distance. And so in that scenario, we might move from 500,000 deaths to 200,000 deaths. But in both scenarios, 3 times the number of Black people are dying, because those disparities are built into US structural racism. And none of these forecasts say anything about intervening into the risk structure that allows people of color to be infected much more frequently. So therefore, the forecast, by not intervening on this, endorse a future where the disparities continue to exist. Institutionalized racism is rampant, hyperincarceration is ongoing, UHC is denied, and by Ibram Kendi's definition that a racist policy or a racist analysis is one that either increases inequity or continues status quo inequity, they are racist by that definition. They actively delimit through their exaggerated precision and acceptance of government interventions to status quo our ability to imagine social alternatives. So we formed this commission. Part of the reason was to imagine social alternatives. And one of our first papers in February modeled how reparations for American descendants of persons enslaved in the US would impact SARS-CoV-2 transmission. And I'll skip, you can read the paper if you're interested. But the upshot is that reparations having been paid 10 years ago could have reduced transmission in the US 30 to 68%. And that's because of the mathematical properties of infectious disease transmission dynamics, that the highest risk group comes to dominate what R naught is for the population as a whole. And if you intervene in the highest risk group, you actually can reduce R naught for the group across the board. And so here's just a schematic of that. Here are the mechanisms. And so, you know what, this actually got picked up in the national news, and here's an article in CNN about it. And we've received loads of hate mail, you know, racist hate speech for even suggesting that, you know, contemporary US should pay for the legacies of slavery. And we're not just talking about slavery itself. We were talking about, again, Jim Crow and redlining and, you know, hyper incarceration and lethal policing and all of that. But that was one thing that was shocking to me. I thought I'd seen it all, but the amount of hate mail we received for this has really brought to my attention that how much of this is a cultural war. And we can talk about that in the discussion.
Eugene, yes. You have 2 minutes left. Actually, you're already 25, so. Okay.
All right, I have 1 minute left, yes. And then one other quick critique about how regressions also can commit symbolic violence simply based on the variables you pick. The IHME is known for their global burden of disease studies. Here's one from 2010. And really what they do is they just reify very downstream things. You know, they essentially say in a study like this that the global south lives much shorter lives than those in the global north because of salt intake, hypertension, diabetes. There's no analysis of power whatsoever. And so therefore they do neoliberal work. Such that say Mimbola, the BMJ Global Health Editor-in-Chief, wonders if it's even ethical to publish global burden of disease studies, since they focus so much on the downstream and they really distort our understanding of, you know, global north extraction, the role that plays in people living shorter lives in the US in the global south. And so for me, you know, their stated mission is to improve the health of world's populations by providing the best information on population health, which is somewhat like saying if they existed back in the 17th and 19th centuries and they went from plantation to plantation and said, this many people died of stroke, this many people died of heart attack, this many people died of diabetes and malnutrition, and then moved on. And now, you know, health is going to improve because you have all these metrics. Again, it's a farce. You know, when there's no analysis of power, you're really a study like that would be, you know, supporting the oppressive structures that existed there, and that's what I think is going on in contemporary global health. So, last slide. You know, there's obviously material deprivation that leads to a lot of health inequities, but we can also trace human rights failings to the impoverished discursive infrastructure of objectivist epidemiology. And so just focusing on, you know, things like super spreader as an individual or a mining company or a colonial legacy, you can actually transform global health by transforming its representations. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing. Look forward to discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Eugene. It was really inspiring and stimulating talk here. I'm no epidemiologist, I'm a historian, and so I really wonder if it's possible to create a new epidemiology, because actually I think you also need some more mathematical tools or a different mathematical modeling that maybe has to take into account the historian's work of going and look for in the archives numbers and statistics and the sources for your new statistical modeling, your new epidemiological modeling, taking into account all the historical roots of inequities, like you said, in the United States, if you go back to 18th century, then everything changes in the burden, in the health burden of slavery and the health burden of diseases in the different areas. So I really wonder if it's something viable in the short course and short term, or it's something like, okay, we need to build up a whole new epidemiological education from now in the next 25 years. Maybe we're going to have the earliest graduates which can be really involved in this new epistemological construction of epidemiology. It's really like, okay, what we do in the meantime, in the short term, what we can do to help you and to help, of course, all the people involved in this question. What do you think we can do?
Yeah, thank you. It's great comment and question. So that was part of the goal with the with that study on reparations, the modeling of reparations. I couldn't do that myself. I couldn't do that with my PhD advisor, who's an infectious disease modeler. We got together, critical race theorists, the historian, the economists, the anthropologists, the physicians, the modelers, and to me that was a pretty novel way of using current tools to sort of make these to at least expand the social imaginary about what could go into interventions and into forecasting. But you're right, as far as starting to, what this would really call for is parameterizing more upstream determinants. And that's where the historians would especially be necessary. There's few examples of it, but one great paper I've seen talks about Congo, Brazzaville, and they looked at the colonial archives of where the French were doing sleeping sickness campaigns. And those were very rough. People were getting a drug that sometimes made them blind. They were being quarantined in these concentration camps. And they found that 80 years later, people in these areas in Brazzaville or Congo Brazzaville have much greater mistrust of modern medicine. They're less likely to go to the clinic. They're less likely to go to get their blood drawn. And so when you have an outbreak of Ebola that's contemporary and you say, oh, these people won't take the vaccine or they won't, go for testing because they're ignorant, really, and there are Harvard School of Public Health studies that say that exact thing. It really discounts the determinants of distrust, which this other study has tried to start to look into. So I think it is possible to start to parameterize upstream historical structural determinants, but it is also very difficult. It's sometimes hard to quantify such distal effects. And therefore, I think we have to do that, but we also have to move from this sense that quantitative epidemiology and causal inference are the top mechanisms for getting us truth. We need to get back to historical studies. Qualitative research is as good a form of knowledge production, as far as helping us interpret the past and interpret the present. But we're seeing a swing towards everything needs to be, you're not going to get your gram unless everything's quantifiable and you have causal methods and all this. So that's part of what the book does, to show that the inherent conservativity in the use of big data and causal inference as methods.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a question from Eduardo Missoni from the chat. Do you think, Eugene, your approach may apply to the current pandemic in terms of colonization of the world's policies, imaginary, and behavior beyond the North-South relation regarding the analysis of global power?
Yes, thanks. So I think, yeah, every different outbreak has a different context and a different approach. The one that really strikes me as being kind of an example of coloniality is the vaccine nationalism, or better called vaccine apartheid. This is not an example of where, because I've received the hate mail for this too. Like, how dare you say that, you call it vaccine apartheid, but if the vaccines were developed in the US and Europe, why can't they buy them first for their people? That's not what's happening. There's a level of hoarding going on such that the US has purchased 5 vaccines per capita. Canada's purchased 9 vaccines per individual that lives there. And this hoarding is leading to 2 things. The hoarding and then the protection of intellectual property are leading to a situation where only like 1% of the low-income countries have had their people vaccinated. And it's counterproductive for many reasons. One, we have a global economy. So if the global South economy tanks, that affects everybody. 2, if variants that develop in unvaccinated populations can come back to evade immune protection in the global North. So between the hoarding and this sort of protection of intellectual property, like the position of profits over people, you can again see this sort of coloniality, this the mentality of extracting, keeping everything for the people that already have advantage at work.
Okay, thank you. There is a question for Edna. Your talk was focused on a public health program to control a sexually transmitted infection. Could you please relate what you described in terms of sexism and racism to the history and present of sexual and reproductive health in general, in terms of effect on women liberation and development versus demographic control of the working class? Is it clear enough, the question?
So there are a lot of terms in that question, especially terms that require some unpacking. And so I guess I'll work a little backwards with them in the sense that I would say that the many things that, several of the things that Eugene brought up, I echo in terms of wanting to think about how the language of public health, or how the language of public health policy more broadly, and is very much a kind of legacy, part of the legacy of colonialism, especially who gets to practice, how the categories that are set, and then as I spoke about who gets perceived as disease, and if I'm trying to think about the question at hand, demographic control of the working class. That kind of echoes population control, which I would feel very wary to support. If anything, there have been critiques, rightly so, about population control, because that terminology gets applied to people within the global South, on the African continent, Caribbean, Latin America, to suppose that their reproductive capacities is a problem, or that somehow their existence as a quote-unquote demographic is a problem. So I guess I'm not sure about how that phrasing and the extent to which it's about population control, or if there's another meaning that I'm not fully getting. But I would say that when it comes to questions around reproductions as in general, that people should have, on a global scale, access to free reproductive technologies, or the ability to terminate pregnancies if they want. Unfortunately, that is not always the case. And some of that has to do with colonial legacies. So for example, in Haiti, the anti-abortion laws are like an offshoot of the Napoleonic Code during the colonial period, in which the sexuality and the reproduction of Black women, and particularly population there, was very much dominated by ideas of hyper-reproduction and not preventing it. So if we think about what colonialism's legacy, as well as just the present day, like the global gag rule operates within the US context, it's one to actually give autonomy to people's bodies. At the same time, there's also the legacy of sterilization and the history of forced sterilization vis-a-vis eugenics and what that came with, and how the fight for reproductive justice is also a fight not to be forcibly sterilized, especially those who are of color. And so, in thinking about that, I think it's important to also think about the question around sexual and reproductive health in terms of not just women's liberation, but the liberation of people's bodily autonomy. So this is something that is very much part of the ideology of what I'm purporting. But beyond that, I think it's also important to read the works, in my opinion, and I've been trying to do this a bit more and have been for some time, reading the work of Black feminist historians of medicine and science, such as Dorothy Roberts, Evelyn Hammonds, and Linda Villarosa, and so forth, who've done that work of trying to excavate the relationship between reproductive justice and health in general, especially as it applies to people of African descent. And the question around reparations, I would agree with Eugene, has to be pivotal if we think about unpacking and providing some kind of assistance or aid to those who have inherited the legacies of medical apartheid. I'll stop there since I went on for a bit of time.
Thank you very much, Edna. And for Eugene, there is another question. Do you think that if global public health efforts were directed to the objective of universal healthcare instead of those of disease-specific programs, would it help decolonizing theories and practices?
Yes, thanks. Another excellent question, and this kind of follows on Edna's insights. That I found myself more and more ending up each of these questions, you take them to their logical conclusion and you end up in reparative justice. So I think I saw this week, Tedros had written about UHC being making it really universal around the world. But that, to me, that is analogous to what was happening in South Africa, where the way that apartheid and Bantustans were set up was that the apartheid government would extract labor, bring people to the mines, work them to the bone. They'd get TB, they'd get sexually transmitted diseases, and then they'd send them back to the Bantustans when they were too sick, which were not part of the country. So they would export the healthcare that they were essentially responsible for because they were extracting all that labor. And that's kind of the same thing that's going on analogously when you look at the extractive regimes I was talking about. So a net $152 trillion appropriation from the global south since the 1960s. The continent of Africa losing 50 billion in illicit financial flows per year. How can you expect them to, run universal healthcare when that extraction takes place? It's like, it's the sleight of hand that says, okay, we're taking all this money. This is why your people are sick. Now, why don't you institute universal healthcare to make them feel better? So really, the funding for that needs the loss of funding for it needs to stop. And so I really think that part of this, decolonization effort has to be the reparative justice, the exposing through things like Panama Papers of how these illicit financial flows take place. And only then can you get to the real question of providing universal healthcare when the resources countries have. I mean, I live in Sierra Leone and DRC. They're very rich. They're richer than most, countries, but you would never know it because of the continued extraction of the wealth to the global north.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, this shift from eradication efforts, control efforts to public health, to universal healthcare was already attempted in 1978 with the Alma-Ata Declaration, when the reform of the WHO took place and the Soviets finally joined the WHO, and the Soviets, China finally joined the WHO. So actually, it was already attempted, but actually, clearly, it didn't end very well. The only thing was that it was clear that the earliest technocratic models of malaria eradication, for example, by means of DDT, actually failed. So the only big success was actually smallpox vaccination that could be boasted at the time. But then all the other technocratic efforts based on the techno-colonialism of the WHO actually was repelled in 1978 following the Alma-Ata Declaration. But then again, we are there. The problem is with extractivism, with extraction of resources from the poor countries. You can tell everybody, again, as you said, you can tell everybody, set up universal healthcare and spread all your bed nets and whatever. But then if you don't give them money, if they don't have the money, if you only donate them as a charity, these means of protecting health, not going very far, clearly. It's a matter of self-determination of the peoples in the end. So that's coloniality in action. Any other comments from other people?
Well, one thing I would also like to kind of add too is just how historians from like 20, 30 years ago have been speaking about reparations in a way that's quite exciting. So Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery outlines specific banks in England that profited from Caribbean slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And they still exist, Barclays being one of them, Lloyd's, and it goes on and on. Ana Lucia Arrojo's work as well on reparations, a book that was published a couple of years ago, also looks at it from a transnational perspective within the African diaspora. People have been at local levels fighting for reparations, whether it's Rosewood, which was the city in Florida, I'm from Florida, where they burned it to the ground. It's kind of like Tulsa, and the state of Florida has provided free state college education to the descendants of the Rosewood Massacre, with the sense that providing educational equity in a country that has not been able to, in a country where people have excessive student loans, means that African Americans who are the descendants of those who suffered from racial massacre should be able to be granted free education. And it goes on and on. The city of Evanston has also been doing this with the housing, and there's a petition for that. So the reparations question, and hopefully it being applied to health on a global level, is something that can be made to be realized, especially since we see it happening today. It's not something that's such a far shot conclusion per se.
Thank you. Eugene, I just want to, Eugene and Anna too, do you know the Malaria Atlas project? Was an Oxford-based initiative that took place a few years ago, and is still active, I think. But they had some kind of historical perspective, because actually they tried to collect all the statistics about malaria cases, basically, also in African countries. So also back from the colonial periods, for colonial times, like in Italian colonies, how many cases were there. And now they provide an historical timeline of the progress in the fight against malaria. And maybe it can be useful in order to assess, some kind of evaluation of what have been achieved in terms of, because I've said before that, the only big success was smallpox eradication. That's not completely true. You also have polio. You also have several different diseases whose burden has been suppressed or at least has been decreased over time. So there are some good things. Of course, there are still a lot of problems there, but some success has been achieved. And I found it interesting that these people from the Malaria Atlas project, they were looking for really fine-grained statistics about the different areas in African countries, because they really want to try to look for the numbers for very small areas. Still, you have numbers which they suffer from several biases. Of course, if you go to the Italian colonialists and ask them how the native people fares under your ruling, of course the colonialists will say, well, they're very happy and everything is good. Of course, propaganda will set in also in the statistics, but still, it's something you may start on. I think if you don't know this kind of, if you're not familiar with this kind of project, maybe you can have a look at them, and maybe you can see if actually this kind of colonial illusion, colonial epistemological injustice also applies to this kind of historical perspective they're trying to use. Well, these not really historical, but these large, long scale, long temporal, I don't know, how do you say, longue durée in the historian terms, but this temporal perspective, you can see if this epistemic injustice is at work also there. This could be quite interesting to look at.
Thank you.
So it's 6:30. We are sharp on time with the end of our discussion, and so I will thank the public for the attention, and I will thank, of course, Eugene and Edna for being here, for your very interesting talks and your stimulating discussion. And so thank you again for coming here, for accepting the invitation, and hopefully we'll meet again for other projects and seminars and workshops. Edna, of course, we have something going on together, so please remember that. And thank you very much again. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much also Valentina Mangano for the organization of the seminar. Thank you to the university for hosting here today and providing the structure, the infrastructure for everything. So bye-bye. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Edna. And bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.